The settlement. They passed fields, human settlements, crossroads, and golden marigold meadows, and headed on towards the wood. The trail became more and more indistinct, and the forest turned gradually from a distant smudge into a dark, massive wall. Until, like the advance party, old pines suddenly burst onto their path just as they came over the edge of a hill. Behind them stood a solid wall of trees, lined with juniper and heather. They were greeted by a gentle and solemn hum, like a prayer, carrying with it the incense smell of resin. They were about to enter the sacred temple of the forest. They took their hats off and looked up, their lips moving in silent greeting. No one spoke. They listened intently. The mare led the way. Without thinking, she picked out cracks in the forest wall, a barely visible path. She did not hesitate at turns or in the narrow passages among wetlands. She found footbridges thrown across treacherous dikes. She wheeled and wove, so sure of her memory that she picked at snacks along the way. Now a bunch of rush, now a twig of birch, and she chewed on them for fun. The ground descended slowly. They rode over ancient levees made of oak logs centuries ago, where maybe once Swedish or Cossack armies had passed. They moved along the edges of great peat bogs, cleared a trail through marshes, and got stuck from time to time in the thickets of reed and rush. The sun was in their eyes, at their backs, to their left, to their right, and finally, the only trail to be seen was the one they made, as clear as a path trodden by an elk. Then water flashed among the thicket. A stream spilled into a wide ford, disappearing in sallow beds. They had reached the boundary of their summer kingdom. "Here is our rainbow bridge," said Crane. All three gave a shout, the usual chord with which they called each other when separated during their expeditions. The mare entered the ford eagerly, bowed her head, stroked the water with her lips, looking for the deepest reach, then stood and began to drink. Hathor followed suit, and the men drew water into their hands. "Let us drink of Lethe's stream, forget the other world," said Wolverine. "It's as delicious as birch sap, like wine," said Panther. "And it's full of fry. Look, there, against the sand at the bottom. Can you see?" Crane pointed out. "Oh, and a green-headed drake is there. Can you see under those trees?" The beasts of burden, their thirst slaked, raised their heads and opened their muzzles. The mare neighed, and Hathor tugged at her rope. Both sensed their summer pastures. Even Jake, sitting on Wolverine's shoulder, measured the distance to the first clump of birch, and, as soon as they cleared the ford, gave a leap and was gone in the treetops. The men jumped off. Hathor was released. Wolverine took a cage with the partridges and the basket with the hare, animals that had wintered with Panther on the farm. Let go, the hare was in no hurry to run. He stood on his hinds, scented, raised his flaps, glanced at the men, and slowly hopped off into the heather. The partridges, like yellow balls, rolled in single file behind him. "Do not curse us, you godly martyrs. We are innocent of your misfortunes," whispered Wolverine. When he returned to the wagon, he was alone. His comrades, carried away by the sudden frenzy of freedom, had rushed ahead on foot. Jake accompanied them along the treetops, and the mare pulled on her own in the direction she knew so well. Wolverine caught up with her and walked alongside, steering her from time to time so that the cart would not catch on trees. But he, too, was busy with his thoughts. He read the story of his country's winter. Here, he knew every tree, every foot of earth, and he welcomed it all like his dearest friends. The forest had kept no secrets from him. It told, showed, bragged, and complained. Here was the old pine tree with the killer sparrowhawk's nest, and there another, bent and limp, which had once been broken in her youth. Here was a birch with a monstrous burl and an enormous rowan, which they called the Stunner, and that had so many corals in autumn and a hornbeam split in half by lightning that had survived the blow but shone with the black streak of the old wound. And there a birch felled by frozen sleet, and a squat willow with an old squirrel hole where wild bees had already moved in. And there was the huge anthill, already crawling with life, the great empire of black forest workers, strewn with white lumps of resin and traces of winter raids by black grouse. And here was an alder ditch full of holes, fissures, chasms, roots, torn half out of the ground by a storm, a hideout for snakes and vipers. The forest whispered softly, a kind of quiet panting of the revival of spring. And the man, staring and listening, lost himself in this great, mighty whole, and felt how great its forces entered him, and how he absorbed their power, how they now coursed inside him. Beyond the ford, the ground rose. Their refuge was like an elevated island amid the bogs, surrounded on all sides by peat and swamp crisscrossed by small rivers and overgrown with impenetrable thicket. On this miraculously fertile island, a forest stood in a full riot. Birch trees darted towards the sun, swaying their green gauze-like slender dancers. Lovely hornbeams bloomed, stocky like virile farmhands. Alders, ashes, oaks, lindens, rowan trees, maples all pressed together and upwards towards the sky. And lower down, hazel, viburnum, bird cherry, buckthorn. At their feet, raspberries and blackberries covered the ground. The clearings in the forest were white with anemones, and tall grass fluttered like the ready background for a tapestry yet to be woven by the coming summer. The lingering cries of his companions woke Wolverine from his reverie. He glanced at the sun, then lightly nudged the feeding mare. Home to the cabin, Patch Pelt. We also deserve dinner. Ah, here comes the scout. Krr, krr, a voice said among the branches. Jake fell onto his shoulder, rubbed his tail on his cheek, and dove into his pocket for nuts. They went on, to the left, then to the right, under the braids of birch trees, through wreaths and arches of bird cherry, until a large oaken cross with a carved figure under its own little roof appeared. Then the forest wall parted. A wide clearing opened up, and in its center stood the cottage of the forest folk. Its walls were gilded with streaks of resin and covered by the lace of wild roses and woodbine. The hut was low, spacious, on a high fundament, but still closed for winter, secured with locked shutters. In front of it lay a garden surrounded by a fence, Crane's patio, as they called it, planted with various forest flowers, and shaded from the heat of the sun by a linden tree. Panther and Crane were waiting for him at the gate, and soon began their report. A blackbird has a nest in the vine next to the wall. A bush robin moved into the box on the linden tree. Lilies of the valley are peeking out. I found a viper on the porch. We're hungry. Wolverine was silent. He untied the mare and hung the harness on a peg under the roof. Only then did he take out the key and open the hut. The cold winter air blew over them, out of the interior. They entered the main room. The sun followed, gilding the holy icon of the Virgin Mary on the wall directly in front of them. They bared their heads, and Wolverine greeted the Queen of Poland with prayer and bow. Salve Regina Mater, misericordiae, vitae dulcedo et spes nostra. And three voices joined together. Salve. Then Wolverine lit the lamp in front of the icon. Crane placed a loaf of bread on the table. Panther took down the bars and opened the shutters. Spring blew its color and warmth into the room. Ah, the house didn't fail to house winter residents, they laughed. In one corner, forest mice had built a sheaf-sized nest on the bench, and an anthill had materialized under it at the opposite end. The intruders had to be turned out. Crane began to cook a meal. Smoke blew out of the chimney. The cottage came to life. Jake sat at the open window and watched the work. He had upturned his plume over his head and, feigning hunger, gnawed on a pine cone, spitting out bits on the folk crawling under the benches. But because they were too busy to pay any attention, he turned to bother Crane. And he, having set the pots in the kitchen, started to unpack the cart and carried sacks and bags, pots and boxes to the pantry. Jake liked it. He sniffed and tasted everything, and finally discovered a box of sunflower seeds and began to nibble without ceremony. "Don't ruin it!" Crane took it away. Jake was indignant. "Mine, mine, mine!" he croaked. "Yours, but not now. You're too fat, you glutton." "Mine! Give it here!" protested Jake. "I will not, you greedy glutton!" Crane became impatient. Then there was a brouhaha and ballyhoo, and suddenly Jake flew out of the pantry. Disheveled, his plume erect, he climbed to the top of the linden tree and screeched and screamed from there. "What happened? Where's the harm?" asked Wolverine. "Harm, exactly," Crane replied. "He bit through 3 bags, bit open a box, bit my ear, and now he's screaming for help. Now you all finish up because the gruel is ready." "And my stomach, too," Panther said, rising up. "We swept the swarm away. The rest can wait. Eat." "First the beasts," Wolverine reminded him. "True," said Panther, and bustled about. He dove into the pantry, then into the hall, and took out 2 buckets, one of potatoes, the other of oats, and set them in front of the gate. Then he took the trumpet off the wall in the room and sounded the bugle call. The sound slapped the silence, flew into the forest, shattered the air. The signal was well known because it was answered immediately by a neigh and the distant sound of Hathor's clapper. Leaning against the forest fence, Panther waited. The mare was the first to show up. She snorted with delight and buried her head in the oats. Hathor stoically approached. Panther crouched by her side with the milking stool. "Here's asking kindly for the milk, Hathor, and don't hold back, because we're exhausted and ready to eat." He spoke to her gently. "Lunch on the table!" cried Crane from the room. On the white maple table, under the paintings, lay a loaf of bread, a beautifully painted, steaming clay bowl, and 3 wooden spoons. Crane had even decorated the table with a wreath of marigolds. They took their places on the benches and dipped in deep, like honestly hungry folk. Jake assisted, trying each slice of bread, then wiped his mouth on Wolverine's sleeve with disgust, jumped onto the windowsill, and started his midday nap. "Humans eat disgusting things," he thought with a grimace, closing his eyes. When the spoons scraped the bottom of the bowl, Wolverine said, "I'm going to take the boat, check on the fish, and set the traps. Panther will inspect and ready the stable, and Crane will clean the rest of the cottage and check the vegetable garden. Tomorrow, we will hoe and plant." "First of all, I'd like to change my hide," said Panther, inspecting his clothes. "Well then, you 2 go change and I'll smoke a pipe. And we need the clogs, too." The bedroom was behind the hall, wide and bright. It was where Wolverine and Crane slept at night. Panther slept in his alcove just beyond. Soon they were completely changed. They wore their forest uniform: gray linen outfits and light linden clogs, a leather belt with a knife in a sheath attached to the loose jacket, and a felt hat on the head. "Now the forest will recognize us as its own." Panther laughed with delight, and, taking an axe, went to work in the stables. Crane started to wash the pots. And now it was time for Wolverine to get going. He straightened his limbs with delight, changed his clothes, and unloaded his personal box, full of zoological books, collections and scientific instruments, and thousands of other small items he used for his studies and guarded as a treasure. Then he hung the old sheepskin sleeve high under the ceiling, Jake's nest, and put the boot with Stomper in its corner. He finally loaded himself with fish baskets, took an oar and an axe, and went to find the boat. It had its place beyond the spring, under the old alder, by the stream. Wolverine bailed out the rainwater, loaded the baskets, unhooked the bast strap, and pushed off. The expanse before him was endless, because the bogs were still flooded with spring meltwater. One could paddle in every direction, among the beds of the barely green and young shoots of the rushes. On the water lay spring duckweed, the favorite spring snack of Hawthorne and Patch Pelt, and he soon found them up to their bellies in the water, feeding. They raised their heads and talked in the forest tongue. "Good, wholesome," snorted Patch Pelt. "A bit watery," muttered Hawthorne. He patted each of them as he passed, and said, "Just you remember not to go to the deep end beyond the spring, where you nearly drowned last summer. Both you and we nearly died. Remember, you gluttons." Swarms of marsh birds raved over the shallow water. Lapwings, curlews, and snipes screamed like at a wedding. Golden marsh sallows smelled of honey. Birch and alder smelt of balsam. The oar scooped up golden marigolds and clumps of water mint. And the sun, working its miracles, laughed to see its work. Wolverine paddled up to the water fence, checked the depth, tied the canoe to a stake, and slipped into the water. He inspected the whole length of the fence, mended gaps with twigs, and at the inlet where the current ran, he placed the basket. He worked slowly, methodically, observing all the rules of the fisherman's craft, guessing how the fish might go based on various minute observations, engrossed in his work, and all the time ospreys wheeled over his head. The forest folk knew the rules of communing with nature. They avoided sudden movements, noise, frightening and scaring. They kept a shotgun in the cottage for emergencies, but that hardly ever came, at most as a measure against some predator. Beasts and birds had fast accustomed to the sound of Hawthorne's knocker in their mealtime bugle, and the whole forest now knew well that no harm would come from the three. A small gray boat with a gray man inside it, churning water with the slow stirring of the oar, was now a picture completely familiar to the birds. Familiar, daily, and common. So common that the lapwings no longer bothered with their usual tricks designed to lead a potential hunter away from their nests. Flocks of teal fed carelessly along the path of the canoe. Wolverine set up a second basket and a third, paddled about various fishing waters and bays, inspected the usual hiding places of fish, renewed last year's acquaintance with his companions of forest life, and completely forgot about the time. He was just rummaging in some corner of the lake by the sandy hills to the west when, suddenly, the air burst with a polyphonic predatory cry. There was in it the blaring of ancient military horns and something like the call and answer of the scouts. "There, awake, watchmen, awake! There, watchmen, awake! It's twilight, it's twilight. It's time, watchmen, awake!" It was the cranes, sending their evening song from their inaccessible bogs. Wolverine glanced at the sun and, obeying its signs, turned the boat back towards the cottage. The treetops were red and gold, and a silver mist rose from the water. Birds rushed with the last tidbits of food and the last blades of grass to their nests. The time had come for rest and evening prayers. "I will be late," thought Wolverine. But he did not rush because rushing would frighten the birds. The crane trumpets came 3 more times, more prolonged and more insistent each time. "Evening light, awake, watchmen, awake!" And then the bog suddenly burst in with the croak and chortle of frogs. Green-headed drakes began to splash at the edges of the water and call hoarse, luring calls. The mists thickened. The surface of the water wrinkled with the feeding fry. Up in the sky, white clouds bloomed pink like roses. A song thrush on top of alder trees began its call to prayer. Dusk was nigh. When Wolverine landed at the clearing, there was the usual bustle of the ending day. Crane, with Jake on his head, was bringing buckets of water from the spring. Panther was leading Hawthorne into the stable, and the mare stood in front of the gate, demanding her evening oats. "Hello, Chief. We couldn't wait." "Wait for what?" "Wait for you. Because we have a lot of news. An owl has wintered in the attic and still lives there. The attic is full of mouse fur, a furrier one would think. Probably also a lot of feathers. We shall have to ask her to leave. And the old water serpent is still in the shed. It has grown a good 2 hands. Great tits have settled in the bird boxes, and in one a wryneck. The wild pear tree is all white, like a bride. And there will be plenty of hazel this summer. The hazel bush is covered with catkins. In the heathers by the vegetable patch, a black grouse sits on 6 eggs. Stomper has set out to hunt. Bees buzz in the hive." Crane stopped to rest with his buckets. Panther came out of the barn with a mug of milk. The mare came to join them for company. And so they stood in the middle of the clearing. Patch Pelt repeated one thing over and over. "Oats, oats, oats." "Stuff her mouth, will you, Panther?" Wolverine laughed. "Oh, but no one can. That's not a belly, it's a gaping abyss. Come on, you bottomless barrel." "My goodness, the water's boiling." Crane heard the fizzle of the stove and rushed into the hut. Wolverine took Sleepy Jake into his hands and slipped him into his sleeve nest under the ceiling. The doors of the stable creaked as they closed behind the mare. For a moment, one could hear the chopping of logs and the clanging of pots in the kitchen. But the sounds of work slowly faded. The twilight was diminishing in the sky. But they felt no urge to go inside and eat. Around them, the trees and bushes, beds and rushes, water and earth and heaven, began the last act of the day. The evening prayer of all creatures. At the entrance to their cottage, the forest folk sat down on an oak log, looked, listened, and fell silent. And then, quietly, Wolverine said, "Praise be to you, Lord, who made all these miracles." The sickle of the moon rose above the trees and silvered the face of the saint on the cross, who seemed as if hugged by the mist rising from below and appeared to float miraculously above the ground. The air, cooled by dew, brought the scent of honey and balsam, and the nightingale lute player began to sing on the birch tree by the spring. The frog orchestra struck their double basses. A bat circled noiselessly overhead, chasing moths. Calmed by the great silence, night descended on earth. And thus ended the first day of their forest life.